Good evening from the United States, and good morning to some of you. And some of you may be wondering why you're still up at this time of night in some jurisdictions. But it's great to be here. Good to see you all again. We had a really productive first session of our 5-session board week yesterday. I thought really valuable input. Today, we're hitting all the key public interest topics. Today is complexity and less complex entities. And I want to thank the working group for so much hard work and preparation for this session, and being very responsive to what they heard, which was a lot of input at our April session on the topic. Funny enough, I said on this topic when I joined and made my first public remarks that we will have a clear path forward in my first year as chair, and lo and behold, we're here in June, almost a year after I joined, and it is decision time on what the right pathway, not the right content, what the right pathway for this board is about moving forward. And clearly we've raised expectations from our stakeholders that we are going to make a decision one way or the other about where we should go on these topics. We've become quite popular from all the letters we're receiving from different associations and organizations regarding their interest in this topic. And one of the things I'm really reminded of some of the debates that we had at the IFRS Foundation, IAASB, when they considered IFRS for SMEs. And there was a lot of discussions about whether it was the right thing to do. And one of the things we said to everyone before this began is that the standards will only apply in countries that elect to use them. And of course, we could circumstance about the appropriateness of where for whom they should apply or not. But there will be a lot of jurisdictions that choose, if we go down the path of a separate standard, not to use them. Maybe it's your jurisdiction because you don't believe it's appropriate for the LCEs, but there will be other jurisdictions clearly that have a high demand for such a standard. And my hope is that, at least as you consider it, is be open-minded. Just because it doesn't apply for your circumstances in your country, that don't necessarily think we should exclude the opportunity for others if we could ensure appropriate quality. The other thing is we're getting a lot of good comments and questions from board members and staff and other stakeholders, but like with most projects, even at the outset, we don't have all the answers. And to some extent, if we scope what we're doing and set a reasonable set of principles, we need the working group or the task force or wherever we're going to go on whatever work stream, have them have the opportunity to work through some of the issues and have the benefit of board conversations and stakeholder interaction to refine these issues. But if we block the project up front because we don't have the answers, then it raises some questions. And I was reminded, my first board meeting was 315's approval, and I was joking with Fiona that it was clear that we didn't have all the answers to all the questions even until approval day on 315. So I just ask for open-mindedness on that front. I know everyone comes with this with good intent. So my goal tonight is for us, after we're done with the discussion, to feel good about that we have a clear direction on one work stream, both work stream, whatever work streams we think is appropriate, and that the world understands where the IAASB stands on the issue of complexity and less complex entities. So with that, I turn it over to Roger. And again, thank you to him and to the working group for their hard work, and the staff, as always, to prepare for this much anticipated discussion of the board.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for those great introductory scene-setting comments. Look, I think you've summarised exactly where we are and the guidance that the working group is looking for going forward, and where the board needs to be. We've had discussions for a while now. We've had the opportunities of presenting to the board a number of times. So we need clear direction now as to way forward. Tom, I'm going to start with a parable. I usually start with a parable, and now we've got a YouTube audience. I'll start again with a parable about climbing a mountain. So let me start with this parable. Once upon a time, there was a mountain that no one had ever climbed. Although a generation of mountaineers had come and gone, no one had ever reached the top. However, there came a mountain climber whose skill was known far and wide. Everybody had heard tales of his daring summits and iron will. The Council of Wise Ones pledged to meet with him to show their knowledge and experience of the different possible routes up the mountain. But the mountain climber was in a hurry to reach the peak, so did not heed the council, and after a week of preparation and acclimatization, set off from base camp. Needless to say, he suffered the same fate as his predecessors. Along came mountain climber 2. The climber spent 2 years at the mountain's base, along with the climber's intrepid team, assembled specifically to aid different parts of the climb. They met with a council of wise ones, sat every 3 months, and gained different advice during their meetings, and between the meetings, explored the different routes and options. And so, with a confident smile and after much presentation and consultation, the climber and her assembled team bid the council farewell and began her most challenging ascent yet on the route most favoured, not necessarily unanimously, by the wise council. For weeks, the wise council waited. They hoped the climber and her intrepid team would return, and they were all prepared to never see her again. They knew the mountain, and the mountain was unforgiving. One afternoon, as the leader of the wise council was tending his flock, he sighted a familiar sight coming across the meadow. The flowers seemed to bow in reverence as the mountain climber and her intrepid team made their triumphant return to the village. The moral: preparation, expertise, and heeding the experience of others can help you climb mountains. We look to you for guidance today to help us climb our mountain, and it's time now to choose our route. I'll start by thanking all our members of the working group. They have done a lot of work in preparation to put the paper in front of you. We believe the paper is responsive to the comments that we've heard in the last call. I will not outline the members of the working group. They're outlined on page 20 of 25. And in there, we outlined the experiences of the working group. They have been specifically assembled to address the issues of the group and to bring the range of experiences that are needed. So let me present the series of overheads, which will concentrate on section 3 of agenda item 4. Then we will follow with the 2 questions. Let's go to slide 2, Armand. Okay, look, in April 2020, we presented to the board a 2 workstream approach to address the issues and challenges with the audits of the LCEs, including our separate standard workstream and our ISA focused workstream. We heard general support, but also some concerns and questions about the separate standard workstream. Therefore, for this meeting, we have agreed to focus on the matters to the development of the separate standard and certainly the development principles, to give you the principles that we are going to use going forward for the separate standard workstream. And that is what will guide the working groups over the next 6 months and onwards. The work on the matters related to the ISA focus workstream will continue to be progressed over the next 6 months, certainly around getting the details on how we best articulate the standards, and that will be presented in December. So following inputs from the board, the objective is to obtain the board's agreement for the LCE group to proceed on the basis of the recommendations for developing a separate standard for audits of LCEs using the principles that we have outlined in section 3 of the paper. and prepare a project proposal on this basis for the December meeting. It's important for the board's views that each of the principles as outlined will form the basis of the work that we undertake between June and December in further progressing that project proposal. The agenda paper also provides other information for context, but it's not specifically to be discussed at this board meeting, including section 1 on background, which, so that we don't go back and debate a lot of the underlying reasons why this program was set up, and also description of LCEs. We provide initial views with regard to the LCE description and possible application. Next slide, please, Armand. Okay, we've done substantial consultation since 2017. On the recent feedback, there are no new issues which are emerging. So our substantial consultation, we believe, has picked up all the issues. We are hearing from the stakeholders the need for an urgent and global solution, and we have again received some representations to that view. The global representation, the IAASB showing a leadership role in this particular area. We are mindful that there are many jurisdictions who are rapidly progressing or undertaking the initiatives in developing solutions in their own countries. And the view of the working group is that such fragmented solutions are not necessarily in the public interest. Next slide, please, Armand. We have outlined, and you have received some of the letters that we have received recently from the particular groups. They've all been sent to the board by Tom and Willie, and hopefully you've had a look at those in your preparation for today. Again, it's a good reminder as we continue to get scrutiny in this area and the importance of our work coming through. The common messages are the emphasising the IAASB to come up with a decision followed by a concrete proposal to address the need of audits of LCEs. And in addition to the urgency, there is a recognition that the international solution for audits is preferred rather than the fragmentation. Tom, Kai and Willie also presented to the Edinburgh group in June, and they were unanimous on their support on the way forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the feedback from the IFACS SMPs, the letter expressed strong support for a clear decision. For the members of the SMP who supported the proposed direction, they broadly agreed with the overarching principles for the development of the separate standard, including the reasonable assurance opinion, the risk-based approach, and being based on the ISA principles. It was recognised that the length of the standard was important, and there was some additional initial support for limited or no application material after consideration of that application material in those particular areas. Again, they emphasise the plain written, that it'd be in plain English for the intended audience. They again emphasise the importance in that letter of the importance of professional judgment and avoiding a checklist type of approach, and helpful to have clear statements on why a procedure is required. There was agreement that developing the drafting principles at the same time as developing the separate standard made sense, but there was caution that that any delays in the work stream should not delay the separate standard. And there was a commitment to support the IAASB going forward in this particular project via outreach and however else they could support. So that's great support from that particular group. I'm going to keep on calling Bev in. Bev, is there anything I haven't covered to date on that particular area? Okay, let's go on to the next slide. which is the description of LCEs and its applicability. It's important that the board members remember what types of entities we are talking about as we think about developing the separate standard. The working group has done some work in this area. We recognise that more work is needed in the area about how best we articulate that description. With the description will drive the procedures, the description of the LCE group as to the characteristics of those LCE entities will drive the procedures that are appropriate to be contained in this separate standard. If an auditor finds the standard does not contain procedures for their entity, then that may be an indication that the separate standard is not appropriate for that particular entity. So we understand that there is concepts that we need to work on. Obviously, we cannot prescribe who can or cannot use the standard. We can just develop the standard and put it out there, as Tom said in his initial remarks, in order to progress this area. But we can explain that it's not appropriate for certain types of entities, and we have landed on listed entities. We haven't gone beyond listed at this point. We understand the description around listed and PIEs. We understand that is a discussion between the IAASB and IAASB. But because PIEs at this moment means different things to different people, we have landed on this particular area. We'll obviously keep track of those developments as we go forward. Ultimately, we do see as a series of decisions that will likely make it necessary to determine whether the separate standard can be used or not after we've done the work to fully articulate our description. And we have used that as a decision tree, and we have included the diagram in the discussion paper for today as illustration. That diagram is not intended to go into the separate standard. It is there just to aid the people. Firstly, as Tom said, this is a standard not every jurisdiction will pick up, but it's a consideration. So there might be laws and regulations set by legislative and regulatory authorities or national standard setters that may prohibit its use. They do not see it as an appropriate means within their jurisdiction. We are trying to look for an international solution. They may use the characteristics for use. They may add additional characteristics. We have concentrated on risk characteristics, as we heard from the board, because our standards are written around a risk approach to the audit. So we haven't concentrated on quantitative characteristics or quantitative thresholds. We understand that jurisdictions may consider those areas. We also understand that firms or methodologies may prohibit its use or not see it as a useful way. An individual auditing firm may have its own approach to dealing with LCEs and not need the separate standard. Their methodology may deal with it. So there may be a firm approach where they not use it. As we said, the decision tree is intended only for illustrative purposes to work through. There will be groups that decide not to use this separate standard. There will be organisations at the end, because of their characteristics, the separate standard is not meant for. In summary, the intention is that the separate standard be picked up by jurisdictions, firms who believe it is suitable and beneficial for the circumstances present in their countries. They may pick it up or they may not. Let's get into the overarching principles, which we have spent some time on. Next slide, please. So these are principles that we would like to get feedback on in today's discussion. They may be used, or they will be used to guide the working group's efforts over the next 6 months. The example provided, the example standard which we have provided as an appendix is for illustration purposes only. We were told that it would be beneficial to have a better sense as to what this may look like. So we've gone to where our best evidence of that particular area. It was developed by an informal working group of the IAASB in 2017, with no further progression beyond that informal group. Although the item's not subject to discussion today, it's deemed important to present the illustrative example as it has been developed based on these similar principles as set out today on this particular slide. And so you get an idea as to how that possibly could look like, not how it will look like, how it could look like. The overarching principles presented for developing the separate standard have the same underlying concepts of the IAASB. They are the initial thoughts for the development of the standard. The outcomes of applying these principles may still require further tweaking, and we're looking for guidance on those particular principles. There are areas we can't answer now. We're at the stage we're looking for feedback from you. We are in the area of process. We also need to think more about the proportionality and scalability as separate concepts. The separate standard is a proportionate response to the concern that has been raised that we are trying to address, but there's more that needs to be done within that separate standard within both work streams. And once we have done some work on the drafting principles, we need to step back and look at the overall package. Have we done enough? The separate standard will focus on core procedures for a reasonable assurance engagement. That's what we were told. That will make it easier for LCE audits to apply the auditing standards, leading to a more efficient and effective audit. It is intended that the procedures required be presented in a way that is understandable and easy to use. The scope of the project is audits. We have not considered other forms of assurance. We have stuck with reasonable assurance, and so other forms of assurance have been scoped out. The opinion will be clearly indicated that the separate standard has been applied in the audit of LCEs. The intention is to avoid confusion. There is reasonable assurance. The intention is to avoid confusion of users about which standards have been applied in the audit, therefore ensuring international comparability. As the work develops further, we'll give consideration on how we educate the stakeholders that the separate standard is of equal and robust IAASBs. With regards at application material, the working group at the moment has intended to keep the separate standard shorter and has determined that there will be no or limited application material. We need to work away. That's not to say we wouldn't support the standard in its application, but we need to work out the best way. And that may be not repeating the application material, making that application material accessible where it is appropriate, or developing such guidance such as first-time implementation guidance in those areas. So we recognise there's more work that we need to do, and we will take that forward for discussion. So a little bit more work of that. Slide 8. I think at the moment, Tom, it may be worthwhile taking comments without specifically going into questions 1 and 2. It might be worthwhile taking comments from the board at this particular stage to see if there are any issues that they would wish to raise. So I'll pass back to you at the moment.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks for setting the discussion up. So I believe that you're asking for general comments on the direction and the interpretations of the working group right now. Is that correct?
any views or general comments that the board may have. We will get into questions 1 and 2 very soon. We'll get into the questions very soon, but any general comments or concerns or observations that the board would want to raise.
Okay, thank you. Any comments? Not required now. Of course, we have 2 questions ahead of us, but Fiona?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Roger, for the setup. I'm very excited about getting into the discussion. I was just going to say I'm supportive of where the working group has got to. I think having a separate standard and a broad approach is the right way to go. So I'm very excited to just get on with it. Thanks.
You're of the camp, that, of course, to focus on the details, but broadly supportive of the direction. Okay, any others? Okay, Roger. No one's raised their hand. I think people really are anxious to get it. Clearly, want to dig deep into questions 1 and 2. So I'll let you continue.
Absolutely.
I view that as a good sign.
We'll get. Well, that's right, and thank you very much for that that indication, Fiona. So I think you've answered question 3 for me. So but we really appreciate that going forward. Okay, so the approach. The point is at this stage, I want to just stress, so this tries to align the 2 work streams. The 2 work streams, as we said, there is a lot of synergies between the 2 work streams on the separate standard, and we need to learn from the progress as we continue to go in the potential proposed 2 work stream type of approach. So the drafting principles that we have talked about as being important will be developed at the same time as we are developing the proposal. We'll continue to work on the drafting principles. So at this stage, there will be a focus. We have identified an area of concern being documentation, for example, and that will be a focus of attention for both particular work streams in that area. As the separate standard is to be progressed as a priority, we do expect the 2 work streams to run in parallel, intended to inform each other, as I said, the synergies there. In addition to trying to deal with some of the additional, the challenges that have been put in front of us and looking for solutions, the work is currently ongoing on converting the IAASB handbook into electronic format. We again believe that that will deal with it, and Bev will talk about that in a couple of seconds. The LCE working group believe that the example draft standards, the draft SME standard, which is available in the supplement, is a good starting point. So rather than trying to start from scratch, there has been some work that has been done. And so it is a good starting point for developing a separate standard. We realise that there is still an amount of work that is required to convert that into an IAASB proposed standard. If we have that as a starting point, that will enable us to expedite the development process and leverage the thinking that has gone so far in that particular area. The work on, as the work on the development of the separate standard progresses, the LCE working group will stress test proposals along the way through. We will test key milestones with targeted relevant groups, and Bev again will talk about that in just a second. As we continue to work, we'll also continue our liaison with national standard setters, policymakers and regulators to obtain their views on whether or not we are hitting the mark with the solution that's provided. It's vital that what we're being developed is usable. It's meeting the criteria. It needs to address the challenges and benefits that have been identified. And we do think that as we go through the process, we can outline it, and so those touch points will be very beneficial. Once the ongoing outreach is planned, we do have our third planned roundtable in Paris sometime in 2021. We hope that will be an event that people can for the third stanza of the LCE project. Bev, I'll talk to you just to talk us through the next couple of initiatives, and then we'll go through the questions.
Thanks, Roger. Next slide, please, Armand. So we thought it would be helpful just to give a bit of an update on the digital handbook, because there actually has been some movement on this, and many of you see as part of the solution of the work that we'll be doing in the LCE area. So we have actually started work on this. It's an initiative that IFAC have started. They will coordinate together with our COO, and there's a representative from each of the standard setting boards. There has been a vendor that has been selected. We're just in the final stages of signing the contract, and the work is due to commence early in July. So there are 3 stages. We will involve some of you in some of these stages, particularly the assessment stage. So there will be some work to find out what the needs of the users are with regard to our handbook, how it should look, what the useful functionality should be, what you've seen. I mean, some of you come from firms, so it may be helpful to get your input as to what you find helpful. So we will be reaching out to you in the next couple of weeks. We'll probably start a little bit before the beginning of July with some of that work. It's estimated to be 16 weeks. We all know how that goes. So I won't commit to 16 weeks at this point, but we are hoping that before the end of the year, we do have a digital solution for our handbook. We're still working out kind of whether we do it in different phases, and what it will actually look like within each of those phases. We obviously have to be mindful of what's going on at the IAASB and the IAASB. We are coming off the lowest base, so we still have a paper handbook. The others have some form of digital handbook. So we've got a lot of work to get our standards into this format. So hoping that we do meet the timelines or thereabouts, but there will be something before the end of the year, hopefully. And I think at the September meeting, I will report back, just sort of giving you where the progress is, and we may even have a bit of a prototype that we may be able to show you as well. Next slide, please. And then just Roger had alluded to the reference group, and I know that there's been some questions around who would make up this reference group. So we don't want to duplicate the task force. We have a process in place. The task force and the board have a function, so we don't want to duplicate that. But we also want to make sure that as we're developing critical stages, that we are checking that the standard is usable. So I think at the April call, we were encouraged to think about how we can do a bit of a pulse check as we go along. And so we've thought a little bit about the group. We will need to put it together fairly quickly, because once we come out of this call, we have some principles, obviously subject to the board comments and what we're going to do, but sort of run those initial thoughts through this group, and then work out how we can communicate with them. I'm thinking about how we can be more agile, whether it doesn't necessarily need to be big formal check-ins. There may be where we have a Teams group set up, and we sort of try some of these new processes that we're trying to do to obtain feedback. But the participants on the group, we're looking at probably 10 to 12, which probably means about 15. We will check in at critical junctures. It's very important that we have jurisdictional distribution here. So we have a lot of people on our board from different jurisdictions. It would be helpful if we heard from jurisdictions that we don't have represented on the board. And we're looking really for participants who don't ordinarily engage with our process. So we get a lot of feedback from board members and their sort of outreach groups. We get a lot of feedback from NSS. We have various ways of obtaining information. So we're really looking for practitioners on the ground, but at the same time, people who know about standard setting, because they have to be realistic as to what we can and can't do. So finding those people is going to be a little bit difficult. We will also consider others. We're thinking people who develop methodologies, like representatives from Inflow or Caseware, may also be helpful. We may look to users, so like taxation authorities who use the accounts, whether there's somebody from those types of groups that we may want to put onto this group. So we will put it together, obviously working with the working group and others to find the right people, and then we will start to use them as this pulse check as we go along. So I just thought that those two might be a little bit helpful. I know some of you may have some questions about some of these initiatives, but this is where we are on them for now. So with that, back to you. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bev. Tom, we're ready to get into the questions. Before we get into the questions, I might just pause and ask if there's any of the working group members who want to make a comment which will aid the board's discussion of especially questions 1 and 2, which we'll take together. So if you want to see if there are any working group members who want to make any comments at this stage before we get into this.
I don't see anyone raising their hand, but one more second, maybe people are on mute.
I'm happy that they then believe that I've covered the major points.
Yeah, I see Yoshi put your hand up, but we're just
the working group members at this stage.
Working group members right now. So I'll call you on you when it gets time to the questions.
Okay, great. Okay, look, so let's get into the questions. Dying to get your feedback and your views on the way forward, as we have to have a clear path on the way forward. So we've set out the overarching principles, paragraphs 51 to 72. So question 1, the board is asked for its views on each of the overarching principles set out in the section 3. And whether you're happy with those principles or whether there's any other principles that we should be considering. So Tom, I'll pass it back to you to get comments from the board on question 1.
Okay. Yosh, you were anxious to get your comments in, so I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for Roger and working groups. Very understandable paper. And from the beginning of this discussion, I have been sitting in, so I know there is an existence of strong needs for the LCE audit standards, especially among the practitioners. So, and I appreciate to the excluding the listed companies from the LCEs explicitly, like the page 12, decision 3. The next one is in the audit report, paragraph 69 in the audit report, clearly indicating that the audit is based on different standards than IAASB is necessary to avoid confusion for users, and we supported the working group's proposal. But negative comments I have the paragraph 60 and 62. Under the current practice, if the auditor complies with the full IAASB, such audit is understood to be of high quality, with reasonable assurance given to the financial statements as expected by users. So the key concept is high quality. However, when the core procedures are taken out of the full IAASB and applied as a requirement, I doubt that they can be considered high quality in the same way as full IAASB. For example, the review standards 2400 and 2410, which are also limited to core audit procedures, limited assurance engagement we called. Therefore, making a core procedure or making core requirements is equivalent to eliminating professional judgment at the stage of audit procedure selection, which does not ensure the reasonable assurance and cannot be understood as a high quality audit, we think. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Yosh. Lynn, with a Y.
Thank you, and good morning, good evening, everybody. And Roger and team, thank you very much for a good paper and for the consultation that you've done around the paper. I do want to answer question 3 first, but in seeing you've asked question 1, I will stick to question 1. Generally, I agree with the principles, and I think it's a good way to set them out up front. I like the approach. I'm particularly positive on the fact that the standard would be based on reasonable assurance. I think that's important. And I also like having a structure that follows the process of an audit. I think that will be useful for people, and simple language won't be unexpected from me. Also, in the audit report, actually saying that this audit has been based on the separate standard, I think will be important for users. On the more challenging side, I see, I'm just not sure whether having no application material is going to be practical, but I think that's a wait and see issue. And I think two of the particularly challenging principles that you talk about are going to be professional skepticism and professional judgment, to keep it simple and keep it short, but also emphasise those two particular concepts, and to get the documentation at a reasonable level and understandable, because I do know it's a key issue for LCEs. Going back to where I started, generally I accept those principles. Thank you for a good job.
Thank you, Lynn. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Roger, and the task force for a very nice document, easy to read. I enjoyed it a lot, not really heavy, spending a couple of time going through the whole content. It's really difficult to disagree with the principles that Section 3 include. Makes sense to talk about materiality, risk-based approach, documentation, et cetera, even controls. So my support on saying yes, those are the principles that we should follow. However, when I finished reading Section 3, I got the feeling that in essence, we are not really doing anything different compared to the current ISAs. Stripping out application material, of course, is going to reduce a book from 1,000 pages to 100 pages, which is a little bit what the example or the supplement materials were presented. Writing the requirements in a simpler way that you could understand, yeah, that makes sense, but I don't see why current ISAs shouldn't be written exactly the way you're proposing, Roger. And I think there's a part in the paper that, but I couldn't find it now, that that says there's a presumption that whoever uses the, let me call it the separate standards for LCE, would have a pretty good knowledge of ISAs. Well, if that's the case, and still I do not disagree with that, you could read the requirement, and of course you don't need application material because you already know all the application material from the current standards. So in essence, we're getting back to what we have today. And when you read the principle about documentation, that a person with enough experience should be able to understand nature, timing, and extent with the, I think it says sufficient details. That's pretty much what we have today. So in summary, I'm very supportive of the project of really exploring a separate standard. I think it's the right time to invest an effort in doing that. But just my feeling after reading the paper is that we're pretty much ending up where we are today in a simpler version, 100 pages. That's it for me, Tom. Thanks.
Thank you. Coyote?
Thank you, Tom, and good evening from Germany. Roger, thanks very much for the presentation. I have a general comment, and then I have a response to question one. I start with my general comment, although not included under the matters 1 to 3 for IAASB consideration. My views on the applicability of the LCE standards and the definition and the description of LCEs is included in my comments to paragraph 47. So I want to start with this, and then I give you my response to paragraph 51, which is the answer to question 1. So I start with the comments to paragraph 47. That's the general comment. In my view, the IAASB must take a clear position on when the separate standards for LCE apply. Of course, law and regulation and national standards, in particular jurisdiction, as well as firm policies, may augment such a position. In my view, notwithstanding any law, regulation, national standards, or firm policies, the separate set of standards should not be applied to listed entities and those being listed, banks that accept deposits from the public, insurance companies that enter into insurance contracts with public. This appears to the direction that IAASB is going in its definition of PIEs. In other circumstances, it should be up to the auditor to use judgment as to whether the entity is of such complexity that the use of the ISAs is warranted. I would also like to point out that, for example, some subsidiaries of listed companies, entities, banks and insurance companies are not listed and are not listed entities, banks or insurance companies, and may therefore be treated as LCEs for audit purposes. This should not be an issue since the exposure graph of ISA 600 no longer suggests that the audits of the financial statements of such subsidiaries need to be used for the audit of the group. This was my general comment, Roger, and then now my answer to question 1, which refers to paragraph 51. First, with the principle-based requirements agreed, however, without definitions and some application material, the standards for LCE cannot be operationalized and cannot be standalone. The need for definitions and some application material implies that the LCE standard needs to be a set of standards, and I mean plural, rather than just one standard. Then my next comment is to the question referring to relevant ethical standards and quality management standards. I agree with the compliance with relevant ethical requirements. However, standards are developed for audits of LCEs. Then consideration ought to be given to developing quality management standards for firms do not perform audits under the ISAs. My next comments refer to little b, the high quality audit and the reasonable assurance. I agree, but recognition needs to be given that reasonable assurance is not an invariant concept, but it means depends upon user needs and nature of the matters being audited. Then my next comment is to a clear, consistent documentation requirements. It is unclear to me what about ISA 230 is unclear or inconsistent. More work needs to be done on this issue before I can establish whether the principle is stated is correct. Then my next comment refers to the principle no or very limited application material. I strongly disagree with the concept of no or only very limited application material. It should be recognized that about 2/3 of the negative requirements in the ISAs, for example, material explaining what an auditor not to do, is an application material. Furthermore, sometimes requirements cannot be understood with application material. Nevertheless, the extent of application material can be reduced considerably, perhaps even but about 2/3 or more. And now my last comment refers to the use of full ISAs. I strongly disagree with the reference in the LCE standards to the ability to use the full ISAs. The LCE auditing standards need to be standalone. A reference to the ability to use the full ISAs would imply that in fact the full ISAs apply. I'm convinced that in case of doubt, practitioners would consider the solutions offered in the full ISAs without such a reference, given the full ISAs official status in the LCE auditing standards. This was my response to question one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take one or two more and then pause for Roger and the work group to comment. Sachiko?
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. First of all, because I'm commenting after Kai Wei, I just echo what Kai Wei said in the first. I think in this project, clarifying description of LCE, I mean, what is the applicability of this standard is very, very important. And also, I also echo the Yoshi and Lin said that it's very important that, you know, auditor's report clarify that, you know, the audit is conducted in accordance with this separate standard. I think this is very important point. My comment is actually similar to what Kai Wei said at the end. I have a comment on the fifth bullet of paragraph 51C that states intention to be able to use full ISAs where a matter is not addressed by the separate standard. I think this is not necessarily a right approach. During the audit, if the auditor identifies a matter that is not addressed by the separate standard and that needs to be addressed in accordance with the standard, I think it indicates the possibility that application of the separate standard for the audit is not appropriate. I agree that the relationship between the full ISAs and the separate standard should be clear. However, allowing to use the full ISAs may result in blurring the distinction between the full ISAs and the separate standard and causing inappropriate use of the separate standard for the audit of the entity, which should not be classified as a LCE. That's all my comment. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Sachika. Julie.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. Thanks, Roger, for all your work in the task force for bringing forward the paper. I would say fairly consistent with what others have said. I was generally supportive of the overarching principles. I did have some thoughts on a few of them, and so I'll just highlight those for you to be succinct here. So, and my comments are in the premise of the fact that I think for usability and longevity of the LCE standard, that we should be thinking about this as a standalone standard. And so some of the overarching principles feel a little bit in conflict with that premise. The first one that we've hit on, a couple of people have touched on, is the application material and the objectives, and not maybe having much in the way of application material or streamlining the objectives. I understand why that's put forward as a principle. I do I have heard many times from people in this space that operate in this space that they oftentimes want to be, there's more, and ask for more prescription about what to do. And so I don't know if it remains to be seen a little bit what that would look like if we didn't have the application material and some sort of more directed objectives for those practitioners. Otherwise, I think they may be a little bit, looking for other materials out there to support their audits. The loop back to the IAASB, or sort of referring back to the IAASB when the LCE standard doesn't address the issue. I think there could be some challenges there as to what point do you cross a threshold between the LCE standard, or an audit done under the LCE standard and an audit done under the IAASB. So I think that the task force probably needs to spend a little bit of time as to what that looks like, and at what point are we really, like Sachiko said, blurring the lines between an LCE audit and an IAASB audit. And then from a longevity perspective, I think having these practitioners required to have an understanding of the IAASB won't be a near-term problem, but I think longer term, from a longevity issue, I think it could become a problem, because I think over the longer term, especially for practitioners that spend most of their time in this space, I'm not sure that premise will hold longer term, and that they may be operating their practices such that they are primarily doing audits in the LCE space and maybe aren't keeping up with the details of the IAASB and keeping pace with the IAASB. So I think, like I said, I think shorter term, that's not so much of an issue, but if we want to think, future proof, and longer term, that could be a problem. So those are the three that sort of stuck out to me as potentially ones that you might want to think about from a task force perspective. And I think Glenn said it remains to be seen what comes out of it, but those are the ones that I flagged. And then lastly, I do think the criteria or characteristics for an entity to which standard applies, being really clear about that, I think can help effectively address some of the issues that have been raised on whether or not some of these principles could apply, because I do think there needs to be a clear boundary as to which audits fit in using the LCE standard. That's it, Tom.
Thank you. I'm going to pause there. Just on that last point, since a few people raised it, I'll ask the question of Roger and then ask him to respond. My understanding of it is that you just wanted to absolutely exclude listed entities for the time being, but you thought that there would be further clarification as part of the ongoing work of the working group or task force. And that was because we've heard a lot of noise, particularly concern that this could bleed into audits of listed entities, and you wanted to take that off the table from the very start. Is that correct? And then maybe I'll ask you to respond to the other issues. We're about halfway through. I recognize everyone has hands up. I just felt like rather than have all 18 board members comment and then Roger and team having to respond to it, maybe take it like a halfway stop in between.
You're absolutely correct on the listeds. We wanted to take that one off the table. We certainly heard from Public Interest Oversight Board and others about the issue of listeds. We understand the definition of listeds is a little bit problematic and may not include some, as Kai has pointed out, that clearly the full set of standards should be there. So we will keep a close eye on the project as Listeds and PIEs works through for the separate PIE public interest, and we will adjust that to that particular area. So look, Tom, I'll take the chance to work through some of the comments. There was a little bit of consistency, and what I saw there was a little bit of a challenge as to what we need to clarify going forward. It wasn't necessarily an exclusion or an opposition to anything, but just what we need to do or what we need to highlight in the project plan, so where the group can work on. Certainly the area is around the definition of LCEs and who applies to this separate standard. We understand more work needs to be done in that particular area, and certainly picking up the work of Sachiko in the area as to, or the comments as to, if there is a requirement that's not in the LCE standard? Is the LCE standard that is applicable for that entity, is the LCE standard the right place? And that's the right question. Do we have the full solution to it? That's the question that we need to ask. So that's on the requirements. On the application material, yes, again, it's we heard concerns about how do you get back into the application material for these entities that are being done in these particular areas. Again, that's the right question for those where the requirements are right and the standard is right, how they access the application material where that is beneficial. We don't want to repeat the application material. We don't want to make the standard extraordinarily long, but we have to have the right solution on the ability to get back into the application material where it is beneficial in bringing a requirement forward. So there are a couple of questions around the requirement. They're the right questions. Do we necessarily have a solution? They are the issues that will have to be dealt with as we set the project plan and then we work forward. So, you know, if we had all the solutions, we wouldn't need to actually have a project group working because we'd be giving them the solutions. So they are the right questions. Some of the other areas, I'm not hearing a lot of issues around the requirements as we've set. So people haven't necessarily commented or suggested that the requirements are incorrect. There is some discussion, and we'll have to have the discussion around the fact as to whether we do want high quality. We certainly don't want to get back into reviews, Josh. So that was never the intention. The reviews are a set of procedures. We do want a high quality. We believe that the standard has to be deliver the same level of assurance as would be done under the suite of the IAASB. So that is an area. We need to make sure that people have said we need to make sure that professional judgment and professional skepticism are appropriately scoped in for this particular area. So how do we do that? And we will address that. Julie brought up the issue on knowledge of the IAASB. And that's where we start off from the basic premise. And will people lose knowledge of the IAASB? Well, that's going to be an issue as to, again, it's an issue and we have to think up of a solution. So the working group has not necessarily done that. It is an issue that we can put on there as to what would be expected. We do put a lot of material out as to, you know, first time application, as to why the requirements, if an ISA is revised, as to why an ISA is revised. We need to work out how that material is reflected for this group of auditors and what is the best approach in those jurisdictions for those firms, for those entities that elect to do that particular area. I think that's covered on most of the major points. Bev, is there anything that you want to come in on there to add? Or Kalina?
Maybe just on Fernando's point, which is a good point, and that is that what's the difference between the two? And I think that on the working group, they sort of see it as a lot of the noise goes out. So it's a little bit easier to work out what you need to do, because one of the things that we hear LCEs or S&P audits is that they often have to do procedures that add no value and no benefit. And so because they have to go through and work out what they have to do, what they don't have to do, they're filling in all these checklists that are not seen as very useful to try and comply with all the ISAs. If we've taken some of the complex areas out, then they're not going to have to fill in those additional checklists and things. It'll be a lot more direct as to what needs to be done so they can actually focus on the risks and perform procedures to address those risks. So I think that's the idea of the separate standard. Whether we'll get there, obviously we need to try. But I think the point is that it will be similar, but without maybe some of the complexity and the auditing around some of the more complex areas. Thanks, Roger.
Okay.
So Kai Morhan hand up. I didn't know because he's on the working group. Was it respond to something that was said?
Yeah, it was to respond to partially what Bev just responded to, but also on the issues on application material. I hear a lot of challenges saying that we will not have application material. I think the assumption is that we will need to develop the standard first to see where we're at, and then how we can leverage off of the application material and guidance that's in the ISS so that we won't duplicate all the work. But I think it's something that we'll need to see further down the road, and we will, as Roger said as well, no intention of doing a full set of the separate application material, but we'll see based on the feedback that we get on the standard.
Okay, so we have a lot of hands still up to go through, and I hope to go through this round before we break. Josephine.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to staff, Roger, and the task force for the hard work that's gone into the papers. And to Tom's point, I do believe you have been responsive to a number of comments made at the last meetings. Also, thanks to Bev for the update on Digital Handbook. I was glad to see that there's already some progress on this. Generally, I'm happy with the approach, with the focus on the drafting principles, working alongside the development of a separate standard, because previously I felt that there was a little bit of a cart before the horse approach, and this is much clearer now, so thank you. I'm also supportive of the development of a standard that focuses on the process. I was thinking about that when I mentioned that in April in regard to the drafting principles, but this is also a good outcome. I really only have two comments. And the first is on the overarching principles. So this is to question one. So given that the first part of the methodology is that the standard will be based on the ISAs and therefore draws from the standard, the point I made the last time we discussed this, and I still feel is critical to this methodology, is the proportionality test. And with that, an understanding of the users of the reports. And I think Kai Ua made a comment earlier about the users of the reports too, in relation to reasonable assurance. So whenever a working group comes to a conclusion that a standard or a certain aspect of a standard within the ISAs, and that includes the application material, isn't relevant to an LCE audit, it has to be determined on the basis of users' needs, and therefore a proportionate response in all circumstances. So essentially you're working backwards from how we've worked before, that the burden of a measure that's in the standard is no longer proportionate to the public interest benefits that you obtain from the standards or the measure or the whatever it might be, whatever aspect of that standard. And I think not only in order to achieve the objectives you set out to achieve, but also so we can demonstrate to our policymakers or regulators why what could potentially be perceived as a less than ISA audit, that's to Yoshi's point about high quality. So what potentially could be perceived as less than is in fact a proportionate response to the targeted entities. And I understand it's a very detailed, complex bit of work, but as I say, in my view, it's a fundamental part of the success of this project. And the other thing I want to make a point on was on the definition as well. So I already had a chat with Roger about this, so he knows it's coming. I'm actually beginning to question our approach to a definition. I'm concerned about the professional judgment characteristics route. I completely understand the drive for characteristics, but I also believe that a clear definition of the class of entities for which the ISAs for LCEs is intended or not intended, in fact, is potentially the direction we go. I think it's essential so that, first of all, we can decide as a board on the requirements that are appropriate for that class of entities. So that's the proportionality test. And then we have national regulatory authorities who are much clearer about what class of entities could apply the standard in our view, and don't have to then apply two levels of judgment. So one judgmental decision based on the characteristics of the entity and one based on whether they agree those characteristics are appropriate. So I think I go years back to the way the IAASB approached this, and they started out entities that do not have public accountability. So that would include listed and PIEs and potentially other entities of public interest. So the point that Kai made earlier. So something at a higher level, as you say, can then be modified nationally to suit the jurisdiction's own consideration of what is in the public interest. They might choose size or number of employees to modify that. And I think that is a much better approach, as I say, for the two reasons I've mentioned earlier. I'm trying to be succinct, but there's lots to talk about, isn't there? The only other point I suppose I just wanted to mention was that I can't find it. With respect to the group audits point, we do need to be clear that the audit is of the group financial statements, and there's a group engagement team that will apply a set of ISAs when performing that audit. And then when they reach out to other component auditors to perform work for them, they would do that under that particular ISA. So I don't want to confuse the statutory audit and the audit of the group financial statements, because that still seems to come up now and again. So we just need to be clear in our project proposal what we mean by that. But again, thank you for all the hard work in this. It's really good progress.
Thank you, Josephine. Len.
Thank you, Tom. Roger, thank you very much for the paper. A very good paper to follow. I have a few comments and maybe questions, but just want to say from the beginning, I fully support the task force and the working groups the effort in terms of proceeding down the road to look for a solution to address the scalability, proportionality. Also, support looking at separate standards. So any questions and comments I post, it doesn't mean I'm against it, but just want to give you my full support on a project. A number of comments and questions have been raised by other board members, and just maybe I just want to supplement or maybe in addition. I do struggle with the listed companies definition. I think Josephine said it, and also Akai Uwe also said it. I think we need to be open-minded when we go down to the go through a project, and maybe open-minded. I mean, perhaps we have to revisit the listed entity definition if we go down the path scoping it out. But might be the definition is being there for a number of years, and with the evolution of capital market, how different regulation has changed, you might actually inadvertently scope out a company that may not be fall under the scope of the very narrow definition we have in the ISAs unlisted entities. A couple other points about fraud. I know you mentioned that in the beginning of the paper. I know we do have a separate project on fraud, but in a lot of emerging countries and some of the less developed market, a lot of fraud is actually done in the LCE area. So probably a lot of work needs to be done, at least in conjunction with your working group in terms of looking at fraud. Group audit, I flagged that, but Josephine already articulated, so I'm not going to focus on that. On paragraph 51, you use the expressions, the separate standards will be based on similar concept of ISAs. I kind of trip over that because in your slide number 8 in your PPT, you use the term same concept. So when I was reading the paper, when you said similar concept, I was wondering there must be something not similar. If it's not similar, how do we describe what's the difference? But in your PPT, you said it's the same. So I just want to clarify whether you mean same concept as ISAs or similar concept, because it could be different things. So maybe clarify that. And on paragraph 55, 56, we talk about objectives. In my mind, if the LCE standard, separate standard, is based on the ISAs, I'm kind of trip over. Are they actually different objectives? Shouldn't the objectives be the same? Objective for the auditors and objective to the standards. But we talk about similar objectives. So I wasn't clear exactly what we mean, similar or not similar. I also have the same comments that Josephine pointed out. This is probably that flow chart in the paragraph 47, that almost a flow chart decision tree, special considerations. To me, it's too subjective. I know we use the words professional judgment, but it's too subjective for me. I think leave a lot of rooms for practitioners to go through that and making decision and swing, whether it needs to be scoping or scoped out. I think that concept is good, but I think we need to do more work on that. one other one is paragraph 72. I think that's the pretty much the essence and challenge of this project. The interaction between the LCE standards with the whole body of ISS. I know paragraph 72 is very open-ended, continue to explore, but I think, that is basically a fundamental question. What's the relationship and the interaction between the separate standards and the entire body of ISS? So Roger and also Tom, I'm very supportive of this project. I had another outreach recently, and 70% of the respondents, at least in the target group, support separate standards or additional guidance for the LCE market. And of course, but between that 70% is evenly split. They wanted separate standards or additional guidance. So I fully support the working group. I'm looking forward to working with the working group in the next 2-3 years as you progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Lan. Eric?
Thank you, Tom, and thanks very much to Roger and the team for all the work. As Josephine mentioned, I think you've tried to be very responsive to the comments that we received in April, and in developing the overarching principles. And I would say that from the comments I've heard tonight, they are comments on the principles. I think they're not just clarifications of the principles. I think there's some people are challenging those principles and whether they should apply. And I am aware of the background to the IFRS for SMEs and note the similarities and differences in the approach. But from my perspective, I just don't see this as a global solution. I see this as a solution that might help certain jurisdictions. And so it's going to leave a number of jurisdictions and firms and possibly practitioners waiting for the solution that they're looking forward to in the ISIS. So I'm very anxious to talk about the ISIS work stream in due course. And I just want to be clear that a national standard setter, particularly ours, and I can't speak for them all, but we don't have the power to prohibit a practitioner using a standard like the separate standard. We can adopt the standard or not adopt the standard, but we cannot prevent practitioners using it if they will. So it's not a criterion that really helps with that. I just want to highlight, though, that I agreed with a lot of the comments made by others, Sachiko and Julie, Kaiue, etc., around the relationship between this standard and the ISIS. And I believe that could create some real consistency challenges for practitioners. I think as well, the lack of a precise definition and the use of judgment will lead to inconsistent use and potentially inconsistent quality of the audits as some go back and forth between deciding whether to use the ISIS or not use the ISIS, as the case may be. I'm worried that if the principles continue as proposed, that there could end up being disagreements with the audit inspectors when they come back to look at the files and wonder why a practitioner did not refer to the ISIS in a particular circumstance. So from my perspective, if a separate standard is going to be developed, my principles, many of them I would agree with, but I would suggest that we need to be a very explicit and clear definition of who can use the standard. I think the standard should be self-contained. It should not allow to cross into the ICEs. It should stand alone. And that means it would probably need application material. And I think that we should not be presuming that users of the standard have a good working knowledge of the ICEs. As others have commented, I think it's a presumption that's going to die on the vine pretty quickly. So I'm a reluctant supporter of the separate standard, but I think if you can refine the principles along the lines I've decided, that would at least put a fence around when the standard is used and would be less likely to create some of the contradictions and inconsistencies that worry me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Bob Dorff.
Yes, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Roger and team for great work here. Also, thanks, Roger and Kai Morton and Kalina for taking a few minutes last week to have a call with me to talk through some of this. With respect to the definition or who's going to use the standard, I do just have a question, I guess, and maybe Roger can address when we get to the end here.
Is there any way you could speak more clearly into the microphone? For some people, I think it may be a little faint.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to the issue on the definition or who's going to use this, I wonder if Roger could provide a little more insight on it, kind of gut feel about the uptake. If the issue is concerning fragmentation, I have some of the same concerns about allowing jurisdictions and firms to decide whether or not they'll use it, because that doesn't seem to really address fragmentation. On the other hand, it seems, based on some of the letters that that you have received, Tom, the board has received, there seems to be some large, groups of professionals that would support it. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. With respect to the overarching principles, I really had to remind myself that those are principles, or I almost viewed them as objectives for moving forward. And in that respect, I support the overarching principles that have been laid out. I have some concerns, and I reserve the right to be a little bit skeptical about some of them, but I think the principles are right. And if they are achieved, I think this project could very well prove to be beneficial to a large part of the world, at least. I do have some concerns, primarily around the viewpoint of the reasonable assurance. And the way I look at it is, if a set of financial statements were audited under the full IAASB or audited under the separate standard, I think there's questions about the rigor of the work, the amount of work, and therefore what is reasonable assurance actually obtained under both circumstances, and a little bit of concern about the position being that will just be a matter of education later on. I think that needs to be addressed more directly than just relying on education outside of the standard itself. A couple of other things I'll just point out quickly. I see some inconsistency that concerns me a little bit in the general or overarching principles. The risk-based nature, I think, is good. Principles-based standards are good, or requirements are good. Using judgment, skepticism are all good, but then I get concerned when one of the principles is about having specific, clear documentation requirements. I'm not sure how you develop specific documentation requirements when you have a principles risk-based requirement that you're addressing. So a little concern over inconsistency there. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that not too many people have mentioned. I really think we need to explore the digitalization aspect of this that's running kind of concurrently. And because I do think that if done right with tagging and so on and so forth, that can be an answer for wading through and synthesizing or pulling out what's important in an LCE environment from a larger body of information. And in that regard, I'm glad to hear that some third-party providers, methodology providers may be involved, like Caseware and Inflow, because I think at the end of the day, the LCE standard cannot become, I don't think the IAASB should be in the business of methodology. And critical to many of the small practitioners around the world is how the standards will be converted to a methodology. And therefore, I think third-party providers are critical here, and we need to make sure that they're involved in the project to the greatest degree we can. So those are my comments. Support the principles and absolutely look forward to the group proving my concerns to be ill-founded. Thanks, Tom.
I think as an auditor, you're supposed to have a dose of skepticism about our ability to achieve our principles and outcomes. So I would expect nothing more, less from you, Bob, I should say. I think part of the idea of why Bev highlighted the digitization is that we are thinking about a product in a digital world. So your point should be well taken, but just if that wasn't fully understood, I think that at least is on the mind of the working group, and working group clarify that later as we hear from others. We have a few more. I hope to get through this round, and then we need a little bit of a break, I would sense, at some point. We have 6 more commenters. Sue?
Hi, thank you. Thank you to Roger and the team for the material put together. I also am broadly supportive of the principles and the direction, particularly things like the simple language and so on. I think, as others have said, I think it's important that we have a degree of rigor around the description of LCE. I think it's important that we have an idea as to what it is that we're looking to set the standard for, in order to be able to then work with others to support further implementation. In some of the outreach I attended, I think there's a bit of an expectation gap that we perhaps need to manage early on, which is that I think some people are expecting an LCE standard to require less work. And I think that's more than what Bev described in sort of less documentation. So I'm not sure whether that's the intended case, but I think that would be one in order to just manage some of the expectations out of there. Like Julie, I had thoughts around the longer term applicability of a standard, particularly the point in paragraph 71, which talks about the expectation that there's a good understanding of existing ISAs. That may well be the case now as we transition into a new standard. But if we look forward, 5 or 10 years, that may not be the case. And we need to be thinking about how we have auditors dealing potentially with 2 sets of standards. And I think, like others, I also have questions around the lack of application material. I actually felt this was a real opportunity for some targeted application material. We often juggle with trying to deal with lots of different scenarios in the existing standards. And maybe there's something there for the SMPC to provide more in the way of guidance. And I also had questions about flipping in and out between the 2 standards as circumstances change within clients. And I think some thought around that would be helpful. And I also felt that actually the digital handbook might be something that helps with this, because if it is well structured, it could provide some of the support to some of the transitional areas. So I'm really interested to see how that develops. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. Fiona?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Roger. Again, I have an overarching comment, I have an overarching concern, and then I have a number of comments through various paragraphs in the paper. So apologies as I work through this. My overall comment is, you make it sound so simple in the paper, but the reality is once you start getting into the detail, it's anything but simple. As I said at the start, I'm very supportive of the standard. I think we should just write a standard, put it on the shelf, and then let individual jurisdictions work out who it may or may not apply to. And that leads me to my first comment on the paragraphs around, I think it's paragraph 38 and 47, and you have a flow chart as well in there. I'm not convinced that the flow chart works properly for me, because I actually think firms aren't the ones that are going to be making the decisions. I think maybe we write the standard, national standard setters will make a determination as to whether or not it would be applicable in their jurisdiction or whether they're going to adopt it in their jurisdiction. Local regulators, lawmakers, whoever else it is that determines what standards have to be applied, would then determine potentially, size of entities, types of entities that this would apply to. So I'm not convinced that we as a board should be determining who this would be applicable to. I think we should leave that up to individual jurisdictions, but at least there's something there if individual jurisdictions wanted to do something. So my overall concern that then comes out of this is, I've listened to everyone's comments now around, yes, supportive of a separate standard, but we need it to be standalone and we need application material and I have some really grave concerns that if we agree to go down the path of a separate standard and the task force is going to invest a significant amount of time in developing this standard, we could well end up in a place where absolutely there's going to be a lot of application material developed. And I wonder whether or not we should still just explore the opportunity of whether that is the right way to go. Are people genuinely wanting a separate standard, or do they actually want documentation guidance? So let's maybe just save ourselves the trouble and instead, rewrite or enhance the SMP guide that we currently have, or write a documentation guide. I am still very supportive of the standard. I think we write a standard with the requirements only in it, but then you supplement it with covering off some of the other major concerns. And I do think documentation is one of the major concerns. People want to know, do I really have to do every single thing which is in the ISA, to Bev's point earlier, when I don't see that these requirements are adding value to the audit, and really I'm just ticking a box and filling in documentation for documentation's sake. How do we get them to the point where they can document truly a risk-based audit for these LCEs? And is that going to be driven by a separate standard, or is it going to be some other way? But as I said, I'm still very supportive of a separate standard, because I do think it helps with some of the fragmentation issues, and I do think we shouldn't be leaving it up to individual countries to come up with their own solution to this, with various standards being developed. And then we get into the body of the section, Roger, that you wanted comments on, so paragraph 51 onwards, and I think probably there's some reasonably loose language in some of these paragraphs where I was a little concerned, for example, around talking about audits being less complex. I don't think it's the audit, I think it's the entity that's being audited that we need to focus on as being less complex. I think for paragraph 55, very similar to what Len raised as well. Why would the objectives be different? I think the objectives have to be exactly the same, especially if the core requirements are meant to be the same as well. And I think there's a paragraph in here that talks about making sure that there's some kind of a mapping document back to make sure all of the requirements in the ISAs have been addressed or at least considered. I must admit, when I read that, I had visions of a checklist of someone taking the ISAs, putting every requirement into a table, crossing out the ones that were not applicable, and here's your audit, which is not what we want either. I think paragraph 64, where you start to talk about the drafting principles and guidelines, the principle of keeping it straightforward, I absolutely agree with, but I think that is going to be really hard to achieve. I agree in paragraph 68, where you've talked about making reference in the auditor report that that the audit's been done in accordance with this standard. Somehow the task force will just need to work out how to make it not look like it's a second-class citizen audit, which is not what we want either. But I think that can be done. I think that can be done and achieved. I was a bit concerned in paragraph 70, where you start to talk about documentation, and this leverages what I said earlier around documentation. To me, certainly from my experience working on these less complex audits, documentation is the key issue. How do I make sure I've documented everything I need to document and have done a quality audit that will stand up for whatever kind of inspection or issues that might be raised, or an internal inspection by a firm? And I was a little concerned here where it talked about documentation needing to be, the documentation requirements needing to be established for this standard. I think we actually have a standard that tells us documentation. What people want to know is, how much do I need to do? And then I started to get into the application material, where I was a little concerned that we're going to end up with a very large standard. It's going to be a lot longer than 100 pages as soon as you start to add in all the application material. And I think that then goes against a whole range of the objectives of this overall project as well. And then I was also a little concerned around just the way it was described, and I don't think this is what was intended, but it read a little bit like, well, we've got a separate standard, and then when it comes to updating, how will that be updated when other ISAs are revised? And I don't see it as being any different to when any ISA is revised. So we revised ISA 315, there are conforming amendments. If we revised another standard, 240, then conforming amendments would flow through all of the ISAs, but should also flow through to the LCE. So I just think we should add that on as a standard work practice. When ISAs are changed, we look at the LCE standalone standard as well to see whether or not any adjustments need to be made to that. So they're my comments on the paragraphs for question 1. But I do want to reiterate, I am supportive. I do think we need something sort of on the shelf for people to be able to access, and jurisdictions to be able to determine whether or not they should allow the application of it in their jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious at 6:42 my time, that's an hour 40 minutes in. We have 4 more comments to come. By show of heads, would you, you could show yes, no, would you like to take a break now for 10 minutes, or continue to go until the end of these 4 comments, break, and then get a response? So the first one is, who needs a break right now? Raised hands physically. Who would like to finish these 4, and then we'll pause. I think finish the 4, then we'll pause. I think, but we don't want to we want to make sure that everyone feels like they have the appropriate opportunity to comment. So don't feel truncated in your comments. Rich?
Hi. So I'm a member of the working group, and as part of that, I do support where we are going on this. I like the principles that we've laid out, and I think that's a good summary of where we've been in our discussions. I also want to point out right now, I mean, we could only be where we are because of the staff we have on the. Kalina and Bev have done a great job of getting us the papers so that we can actually have a great discussion. And that's how we got to where we are, obviously under the leadership of Roger. As part of my normal outreach, I did come up with a number of different views that people expressed that I thought are important. Many of them are similar to others, so I'll try to go quickly. I mean, the same thing about the application material seems to be at odds to say no application material when we obviously believe in the ICEs that we have to put lots of application material. Similar to that, there's an expectation that this will be either fewer requirements or much more fewer requirements, and so there's a concern that there might be a difficult way to get to the reasonable assurance, and that's obviously where we want to get to. So how do you get there if you're reducing all the requirements that you might need if it was a full audit under ISA? Like others, one of the most important parts is laid out in the paper, that this would be an audit in accordance with the separate standard. And I think that's almost a premise that if we go down this route, that has to be the given. And I think that, to be honest, that really does reduce a lot of people's concerns. And to the extent that even the people that had said, or several people that said that they were concerned about how we get to reasonable assurance, they were less concerned knowing that it would be on a different standard, and therefore already the public and users of the financial statements would have a different perspective to start with. I want to point out, I agree with Julie and Sue's comment about the, I think it's paragraph 51, the knowledgeable users. I think over time, the knowledgeable users would not be knowledgeable about ICEs anymore, since they wouldn't be using the ICEs, they'd be using the separate standard. And then similar to Kaiua and Sajiko and several others, the ability to refer to the use of full ICEs, I think, is problematic. As others said, it blurs the lines. I really like Sajiko's comment, though, that you might take a perspective that if you had to go to the full ICEs, then maybe the question of how you got into the use of this standard would be raised, and you have to sort of consider, should you be using the separate standard? Thanks, Tom. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Rich. Isabel?
Yes, hello everybody. Good evening. Like Rich, I'm also a member of the working group, so I'm very supportive of the proposal. I'm also very supportive because I can see the need of a separate standard based on the needs that are expressed in many European countries, and the fact that in France, we had to develop urgently our own separate standard, and which is different from the separate standard that has been developed in Belgium, or that is currently developed in some countries. So really, I feel the need for an international solution. I also feel that need because I work daily in connection with the French-speaking African countries, and a significant part of their audit market is composed of less complex entities, and they feel that need to have a separate standard to deal with that part of the market. So my comments to react to some views that have been expressed is based on the experience we had in France to develop separate standard. And I will comment first on the feeling that it could be a lower quality audit standard, then secondly on the application material, and then lastly on the bridge with the full ISA. So on the fact that it's a lower quality audit, it could be perceived as a lower quality audit, and how could you reach reasonable assurance with less requirements? To some extent, I feel we are back to the debate we had yesterday with automated tools and techniques, where is it better if you have more audit evidence? And in our case today, is it better if we have more requirements? And I don't necessarily feel we need more requirements if we already have enough evidence to reach reasonable assurance. So that's why I'm comfortable to have a smaller standard with less requirements, because if in that kind of entities you can reach enough audit evidence, why would you need more? On application material, the choice we made in France was not to have any application material. I think it's an interesting exercise to try to have no application material, even if I really have an open mind on that topic. But at least it's interesting to try, because often when you have application material, it opens the door when something is not totally clear in the drafting to say, okay, it's not very important, let's clarify it by adding more and more application material. And it's like the Pandora box, and everybody wants to have his own words, and at the end of the day, you end with a very long standard. So at least trying to have no or very little application material, I think it would be a very good exercise for us, because it will force us to be very clear in the requirements. And then on the bridge with full ISA, in France, we decided to have a purely standalone standard with no connections except on reporting. When do you qualify an opinion? We have not redeveloped that in the single audit standard because the principles are the same. But we decided to keep it simple. Say either you're in, either you're out, but you're not in between. So I have a very open mind on all these points, but at least I wanted to share with you this feedback from the experience we have had in France. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Very helpful. Imran?
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, everybody. To put my dress code into context, today is the coldest day in Johannesburg in about 10 years. We're having middle of winter rain. We haven't had this in many years. And there's snow in parts of Johannesburg. So if you're enjoying a great summer's day, this is a very unusual situation for us. And it's 1 a.m. So Roger, I really appreciated the work that you have done together with the task force, as well as the work that Bev and Kalina have been doing on this. Bev and I shared a plate of sushi and chicken livers in Johannesburg 6 months ago. And Bev described to me what this was going to look like. It's great to see the plan come together in this way. Roger, in your analogy, which you used at the start of your presentation about climbing a mountain, I think one of the characteristics of climbing a mountain is that those stories always end well. People always get to the top. But I think what you're trying to do with your task force here, and what we as a board are trying to do, is actually to move the mountain. I think in today's project, in today's conversation, you really started by lifting a few stones for us. And moving a mountain is something that far few people have achieved. But we'll do what we can to support you. In the run-up to this, I reached out to you. You shared with me your slides, which allowed me to do a little bit of outreach. And I went to a medium-sized firm's technical team and spoke to them about it and got written reaction from a bunch of them. And I found something unusual about the response that I got from this audience. I found that people were instinctively on opposite sides of the spectrum within the same small firm. But I found that with very little convincing, you could change people's position on this topic. And I think it's because there is so much to consider, and people come at it from one consideration. When you bring more to the table, you recognize, oh, there's so much more to be understood here. And that's what I got from this evening's conversation as well, that there have been many new points raised, or maybe in some cases just revised or refreshed. And then it brings a fresher perspective on why we're doing certain things. So I tried to take a note of what everyone was saying, to list all the things that I support. But to be fair, most of what I heard this evening is stuff that I support, and not going to go through all of those points. However, Roger, you've asked us a very complicated question in this first question, in that you've listed many, many principles and then challenged us to comment on the principles. And I think it would take a lot more time than just the time we have on the call to comment on it. So let me then take a slightly different approach to the other very good comments we've already had on the principles. I noticed that we've described these principles in different ways in issues paper. Somewhere we call them overarching principles, somewhere we call them straightforward principles, we call them focus principles, and then we call them core requirements and principles. And I think that this type of clarity is what we're going to need to be watchful about throughout the life of this project as to what are these things that we're talking about. And that's perhaps the theme of what we heard many people describe in their comments today. And in that way, I'd like to maybe focus on some missing principles. So I'd be interested to hear what the working group's views at the moment are about definitions in the ISAs, and what the principles would be in relation to those definitions. Because we know how tightly embedded our ISA definitions are in the ISAs and their connection to the code. And I wonder how we would end up writing a streamlined standard without fiddling with the underlying definitions that sit in the ISAs, and what the implications of that would be. The second principal question is a question about how what we're proposing will affect the ISAs, not affect the SMP practitioners and the LCE orders, but how will it affect the ISAs? And I want to offer a scenario that I can picture 4 years from now when we're busy drafting some revision to some ISA, and we have a compelling need about why that should be introduced to that ISA. I can picture a conversation on our board that says, because of the bridge between the two, if we put this into the ISA, it's going to have a knock-on effect onto the LCE standard. Therefore, you cannot put it as a requirement into the ISA. And as somebody who works at a regulator, particularly with the interest around the audits of listed entities and the global concerns around that, I would be very interested to understand what are our guarantees and assurances at the level of principles that will not stop the further development of the ISAs, or put another way, that the presence of the LCE standard is not going to constrain the development of the ISAs. Roger, I think that in looking forward to December and in our consideration of a project proposal in December, we can have a reasonable expectation that at the December meeting, we need to, as a board, have an agreement on the objective of the project. So I heard, or at least recognize, that there are at least 3 different views about the objective of the project. We've heard Bev say, and maybe others say as well during the call, that in redrafting, we want to, in inverted commas, remove the noise. The issues paper, in some ways, and we've heard other respondents say this evening, describe a project that does more than remove the noise. And I appreciate it's a selection of words, but it describes something that does more than that. And the letter writers, the 4 or 5 letters that we've had for this meeting, have very different views compared to those 2 objectives I've just described. And in fact, one of them, just as an example, one of them goes so far as pointing out that 24 pages is a very good indicative length of a future standard. Which yet we've heard on the call this evening that someone described a future standard as being 100 pages in length. And I'm still uncertain, and I think that's a very important objective, so that our board understands what marching orders we're giving a future task force in December as to what it will be. Because a 24-page standard would make the standard 1/10 the length of the IAASB code. And there's a user who's written to us recognizing that that is their expectation, that that's what we're going to produce. If we produce something that's 100 pages long, how enthusiastic would they be? Or if we produce something that's 200 pages long, how enthusiastic would they be? And therefore other consequences. And this comes back to, Roger, a point that you made very clearly at our December meeting. In our December meeting, in the papers that you shared, you described in vivid detail what we learned from the survey that the IFAC did on our behalf. And the IFAC survey came back with what was probably the largest group of respondents on this topic. If I remember, there were close to 2,000 respondents on the IFAC survey in relation to this. And IFAC, on the strength of that, wrote to us saying that this is something we should do. You could paraphrase what they said, but the smallest category of responses that were featured in your bar graph in December was that the respondents to that survey gave the lowest priority to complex and difficult to understand as being the issues with the ISA. It came at the lowest of the areas that they analyzed. And in fact, their first requirement that they had the highest scores for was useless requirements. And their second concern was onerous documentation. And Fiona and others have reflected on the second point as being, this is what people are concerned about out there, the onerous documentation requirements, but the first one being useless requirements. And I find that concern needs to be addressed by the proposals we made. And we've had a few speakers today. Eric was very eloquent in how he described it, whether in fact what we were putting forward continues to address explicitly that which the users say they want to see addressed. Because if we carry all the requirements forward into the new standards, but with simpler language, what does it do to those requirements that at the moment those users may think are useless requirements? And I think that IFAC survey may even use that word, requirements that don't contribute anything to audit evidence. Lastly, not lastly, two further points. One is that I don't know if people have said it in these words, but certainly in this bit of outreach that I've managed to do, the question being asked of me was, if the effort is going to be less and the cost of doing the audit is going to be less, you can see the cost question comes from having spoken to a group of practitioners, then how is it possible that the reasonable assurance being provided is going to be the same and the opinion is going to be the same? And I think people are conceptually battling to understand this. If effort is less and cost is less, how do I give the same kind of opinion? My son, who's studying medicine, described it to me. He says, "Dad, you're overthinking this thing. If you take the appendix out, it doesn't matter whether you spend 15 minutes removing the appendix or 1 hour. It's the outcome that matters." And I don't know whether there's any equivalent in that. Last point. On the way forward, I've heard two proposals made so far. One proposal, I think, was this idea that let's go ahead and do it. And Bev promoted this idea when we spoke about it 6 months ago, and then put it on the shelf and let those who want to use it, use it. And I think that's one possibility that we can be explicit about. I think another possibility we can be explicit about is, as you think about the December proposal, the December project proposal, is it whether it's possible within the 2 years before we get to ED to have some sort of a gate or a stepped approach between the two, that people are asking for more color around these principles. Isn't it reasonable that 12 months into the project, we find a mechanism for our board at that point to say, okay, now that it's colored out, we're giving the last green light to continue to the final step or not? That actually there are some issues here that are irreconcilable, and we need to go backwards to the drawing board. So people want to see this move forward, but I hear some fundamental concerns being expressed, and maybe the way to move forward with fundamental concerns is to say, well, actually give us an opportunity to provide more color. Let us write more. And if we write more in a year's time, the project has started, maybe the project proposal offers the possibility of a safeguard at that point. Thanks for letting me make those comments, Roger and Tom.
Thank you, Imran. Jim, last but certainly not least in the long queue, and you've been very patient, and you're still smiling at me, so that's a good sign. Please.
Okay, let me first just say that we have discussed this at the CAG level, and so I did want to reiterate a couple points that came up from the CAG. One, I'd like to thank Roger and the task force for their work, of course, that they've done. The CAG had suggested that one avenue would be to go with the principles first. And so I appreciate how you've articulated that in your paper. Secondly, the CAG also had indicated that there should be some emphasis on fraud. And I guess if you think about, I don't know if it's less documentation, but certainly less application guidance, I think that does highlight the risk of fraud. So that was a component of the CAG conversation. And then with respect to whom this applies, I did want to talk a little bit about the public sector, because I know with the EQCR, it became a bit of a challenge. But I think many of the users potentially of this would be in the public sector. And I think you have to be very judicious, or I'd like to see how you propose that some public sector may fall under this and other public sector may not. So it may be something that would have to be resolved at the jurisdictional level. But I think I think it's going to be a much more significant group than maybe has been contemplated. And that's all I have. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, that was a very robust round of comments, and I'm glad that I think everyone not on the working group got to speak, but also a few members of the working group. Let me give a little bit of what I heard. Also, we'll give Roger some time to pause. We'll take then a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and have the reactions from the working group. So I heard a lot of support. First of all, support for the fact that the working group was responsive to our discussion in April, as I said up front, and that the biggest thing was getting principles down on paper, and in many ways supportive of the broad direction of it. I heard areas which I viewed were not fatal but important for the working group to consider, was the issue of proportionality and working backwards using that principle of proportionality. There was a lot of discussion about whether the standard should or should not be standalone, i.e. the concern about looking back to ISAs and whether that would blur the line. There was also some question about whether there's a need to really further refine the appropriate use of the standard. Which types of entities could these apply to in terms of audits? There was a real robust discussion about that sort of follows the standalone question about whether the approach to application material is properly articulated. Also issues of digitization. To me, all of those really are important constructs about what will guide the project going forward, but not things that are, saying, irreparable to addressing. Even those who had voiced more skepticism sort of stated a sense that the working group should be able to work through some of these, and it would be parts. I also take Imran's point about gating procedures. I thought that was very akin to Julie's point about sort of our agile technique, and sort of was what I'll let the work group respond. What I understood, the creation of a reference group was partly to help us address. So I'll take a pause there. I hope I didn't get everyone's comments in, but I wanted to take some broad themes in, help people to help the working group get their thoughts together. Let's take a 10-minute break. It's 7:07 right now, maybe a 13-minute break. Reconvene 7:20 p.m. East Coast time, and I'm hopeful that we'll finish on time, but bear with us if we're a few minutes late. I think based upon where we are, it's roughly able to accomplish on time delivery on this one, but this topic is very important, and I don't want to shortcut our discussion. Roger, are you fine with that approach?
Yeah, I'm fine, Tom. Look, you've actually summarised it very well. Look, I can come back and talk about a couple of those areas going forward, but I'll keep that at a very high level rather than responding to individuals. We actually have two questions going forward, and I think we've covered a lot of question 2 already, but so we might do that on an exception basis to see if there's anything that people haven't raised on question 2, and then we'll get an indication from people on question 3, Tom. So that'll be a bit of the structure for the rest of the 40 minutes plus.
Okay. So we took one of the minutes. You have a 12-minute break right now. So I'll see you in about 12 minutes. Okay, thank you. Started about a minute. Okay, we should probably get back going. So if you're off video, but you're near your computer and you hear us, it'd be great for you to get back on. Okay, Roger, I think we're at quorum right now. And I'm conscious of time. I'll turn it back to you for some reactions to what you heard. Even though you sort of started your reaction already.
Yeah, okay, Tom, I did have a chance to go and get another coffee, which was good. Look, I'll keep it at a very high level principles base, so I won't address everybody's particular comments, but we have heard, they have been captured, and the working group will consider them. What I'm hearing is effectively support for the principles for the methodology for developing the separate standard. The intended outcomes didn't get many comments, but there are other development principles that we need to think about, or people want a little bit more comfort or more detail. Certainly in who can use the standard, and we have flagged that the working group will look at that a little bit more as to, and people want a very clear line as to who can use the standard. So it's not really a choice, although we recognise that some of the standard as to how it will be determined will be there, but is there areas that we scope out from an IAASB. We have heard very clearly on application material, and going forward, we're going to have to make sure that we are very clear. You've heard the working group's view on no or very little application material, but we will take away the considerations of what we've heard there. And very clear on the messaging. This is a reasonable assurance engagement. This is an engagement which provides same level of assurance for these particular group of organisations as if the audit had been done under the IAASB. Many people may look for different solutions. They are looking for a solution to their problems. They may be looking for a simple way of shortcutting. This is not going to give them a simple way of shortcutting, which may result in a different area. So there's a lot of messaging that we have to do with that. Tom, what I think it would be worthwhile is effectively asking now as to whether, question 2, as to whether there is anything else that has been brought up that would be useful for the working group's contemplation, and then we'll go into question 3. I think a lot of people have answered question 1 and question 2, but basically I'll pass back to you to see if there is anything else, any other matters that that the board members would like to bring up in public forum for the working group's contemplation.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I think Philly wanted to come in before we turn it back to the board.
Thank you, Tom. And I just wanted to come back on just four quick points. Thank you very much for the input. This is exactly why we needed to have this discussion. I think the task force has received a lot of very good input in terms of further refining the overarching principles that have been presented. I just want to make sure that some of the key messages that I heard is clearly about the scope of the standard in terms of the entities that are in or out. And as we've discussed this, it has become clearer in my mind in terms of that we should focus this very much on who is this designed for. And we will put parameters around who this is designed for. And that can then always be narrowed at the jurisdictional level, at the firm level, through a different hierarchy. But I think it is a question of we need to be clear that it is only designed for certain entities, and that is something we can certainly have a look at. Then the other thing that I think is very important, I think when Josephine explained her points, I think the penny dropped for me in terms of what was meant with a proportionality test, and I think we have covered it in the paper in terms of referring to the fact that we will also map back to the standards. And it's sort of that double check to make sure that what we have left out, there's a reason for it in terms of still serving the purposes of the entities for which it is being designed, for. I think we've received a lot of input in terms of refining the overarching principles, and that is excellent. That is why we had the discussion. And then I just wanted to say, because it came up a few times in terms of the work effort, words were used in terms of less work, in terms of people struggling to understand how, if you do not do everything that's in the ISIS, how you can still reach reasonable assurance. And we can't solve that now, but maybe just the perspective to that is, remember, the reasonable assurance doesn't come from the amount of work you do. It comes from the application of the risk model. And if you design your audit procedures to be responsive to your risks, that is going to be context specific. That's going to be in the context of that entity. And if that entity, there's not a lot of risks that arise, and you can address those risks in a much more straightforward fashion, there's nothing that will prevent you from still reaching reasonable assurance. But that is some of the things that we will certainly take back. And then obviously we've made a note of the documentation, the comments around documentation as well. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Veli. So, Roger, you're asking us to say what hasn't been picked up by previous comments for question 2, with the understanding that many people have already commented on question 2 already. Okay, Eric.
Thanks. Just one extra point. I just wanted to support Imran's concept of a gate or an exit ramp with some clear criteria around what that would consist of. I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Julie?
Yeah, just one point. Thanks, Tom. Just one point, Roger, was I flagged that I didn't see in the paper whether the working group had or was going to have a consideration of if or when there might need to be a considered convergence with a separate standard to the ISAs. And I think that's longer term, right? Because when the ISA work stream works on what they're working on and the separate standard, is there a checkpoint at some point to say, or have we come closer than maybe we are today between the two, and is that a consideration in the project plan down the road?
Thank you, Julie. Lynn.
Thank you. A few points, they may have been covered. I just want to emphasise that I think they're important in putting the plan together. One is, I think, one of the biggest advantages of and biggest changes we can make for users is digitalising the handbook. And in that regard, I think that will help with my second point, which is the need for extremely good cross-referencing in putting together the standard. My third point around the description of what an LCE is, I want to reinforce how important considering the public sector will be there. I know Jim's made the point. I want to reinforce it. But I don't think we should overthink this, because jurisdictionally things are very different and people will use their own frameworks and their own models. My fourth point is to pick up on the point of maintaining the standard up to date, not only conforming amendments, but also at a set time actually standing back and reviewing the whole thing. And finally, to reinforce, this seems the appropriate approach at this point in time. But as things change, I think we need off-ramps and reconsideration points in the plan as to, is there a better way to do things? Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. Just I'd say a lot of things that Lynn just said are close to my heart. I agree with them. I won't repeat them. The one other point, though, was the diagram that was included. I not only did I like it, but you know, it was on the group, so of course I did. But many of the people I reached out to also liked it, and they wondered whether you know, we're doing something different here. Maybe better use of diagrams and flow charts might make it easier to understand what you're getting to, fewer words, especially if you're not going to do application material or not much, then flow charts and diagrams will make it easier to draw really what's needed. Thanks.
Thank you, Rich. Kaiula?
Thanks, Tom. I have a brief comment, but important comment for me, referring to question 2. In my view, the LCE working group should consider whether the LCE auditing standard should be a set of standards that includes objectives, definitions, requirements, and application material. Seeking have just objectives and requirements would lead to an LCE standard that cannot be understood without reference to the full set of ISATs, which is in my mind counterproductive when seeking to have a standalone LCE auditing standard. Thanks.
Thank you. Len?
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I heard about the comments about, from a practitioner perspective, practitioners demanding separate standards. And also in your paragraph 78 of your paper, you talk about perhaps reach out to IAASB and IFIA. So I'm just speaking and thinking about if we are scoping out the listed companies, maybe the value of speaking regulator is actually outside IAASB and IFIA, because in a number of jurisdictions, when there are statutory audits are required, and those are small, you know, less complex entities, and whether the user of the audited financial statement using separate standards, whether the regulators in that jurisdiction have the view, policymakers. So perhaps you know, it's good to talk to IAASB and IFIA, but I'm just wondering whether we need to broaden and talk to the regulators who actually mandate the audits of LCE. Thank you.
Thank you. Yosh, I'm conscious that you have a time constraint. Is there anything you would like to say before you depart the call on any matter? No. Okay. Perfect. I just knew that you had a time constraint. Okay, Roger, I turn it back to you to respond to what you've heard.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Look, again, some great comments and food for thought for the working group. I'm hearing exit ramps or off ramps. So not only how do you get into the standard, but how do you get out of the standard in those particular areas? It probably comes back to a comment from Sue as to whether an organisation is in the standard or could be within the standard or outside the standard. Without discussing this at the working group, if an organisation is sufficiently dynamic that in its characteristics change, that it's within the standard versus outside the standard, then it's probably a reasonably complex organisation in those areas. So it's probably outside the standard, but that would have to be discussed at the working group. Hearing the issues on standards and conforming amendments, certainly looking at all solutions to deal with the issues we've heard. So rich diagrams and flow charts, again, I think are very useful for certain people. Definitions has come up. We're certainly not going to create a new set of definitions. Our definitions, that works within the IAASB. So we have to make those definitions accessible. So where that is beneficial, we have to make those definitions accessible. And so again, the suite of IAASBs, what's relevant within the suite of IAASBs for this particular area, we need to make accessible in those particular areas. Len, great point on IOSCO versus IFIA. There's lots of other regulators, especially within national standard setters or within national jurisdictions that would see this as beneficial. I would take as an example charities regulators. A lot of those have been reached out within the national jurisdictions area. But as we develop this and as we look at producing solutions, this is part of the test check. Are we producing a solution that actually solves the problem? So we can, again, as we develop this, we can again test check those particular areas within those. IOSCO and IFIA were, again, very important from a public interest to make sure that we have that public interest right. We've scoped out LCEs. We're looking at public interest in a broader sense in those particular areas, and we will do a test check on those particular areas. Again, many comments there, Tom, that we can take back for the board, for the working group, and bring back to the board, which will give consideration either for the project plan or for some of those areas as we go further and we start to develop a separate standard and we test check that separate standard as we go ahead. So if that's the total...
Ron raised his hand. Imran, would you like to come in on this question too?
Thanks, Tom. I apologize. I thought I had my hand up. Three quick reactions. I think there's been great summary provided by you, Tom, by Willie, and as well as by Roger. Roger, something that you said particularly appealed to me, and that was some of what we've heard today needs to be clarified in our messaging. And I'd appreciate that amongst the things that we're able to clarify is this question of whether will it be as robust as the IAASBs? And from what I gather from the conversation I've heard today, yes, it will be. And that's an important message around clarification. The two further bits in response to question 2 that I want to drop quickly in was coordination with the other boards. And I think it may be necessary to pop in with the education board in respect of this. There's certainly people in my part of the world who flagged for me potential implications on education, but maybe at a board level, that's probably a more useful thing to do. And then finally, as we think forward through to the project proposal, I think unlike any other regular standard setting project we've done, the impact analysis portion of the project proposal is going to be far more extensive than a traditional project, because I think there's a whole range of stakeholders that are going to be affected in many different ways, and really an appeal for us to look deeply into what that is. So when the board signs up for this, we're clear about what those implications are for all of those stakeholders. Lastly, wondering whether there's any thought to how the preface and structure of the handbook changes as a result of us thinking about proceeding with this project. Thank you.
Okay, Tom, I'll respond to that one. Yeah, look, thanks, Imran. Look, I think you're hitting on a concern. I think the messaging is very important there. There are a lot of people, as you say, when you talk to people, you can convince people in these particular areas, and there's an education process here. So we have to do that. We have to get the clear messaging right, that we are maintaining reasonable assurance. This is not a shortcut in those particular areas. This is trying to, and we've used different language, I understand, and sometimes in the call we've used different language to illustrate the point. We're trying to ensure that the standards are appropriate and accessible. The suite of standards and all the requirements are appropriate and accessible for these particular types of engagements. We'll take on board with the impact assessment. We've certainly got a lot of feedback already, so it's a matter of how we can package that and make sure, as well as ensuring that as we go forward, we are having a solution which is solving the problem. And it's not a single source solution. We are trying to look at, this has been done in accordance with the handbook, the digitisation. So there are many types of solutions. So with that, Tom, I'll hand back to you. I think we're on to question 3.
Okay, you want to set that question up for us? I think that's the grand finale.
Okay, yeah, well, so at this stage, and we've had Tom, we've had some agreements. It's very important that we get a clear steer forward as to whether the board members agree with the recommendation. We went to a bridge there somewhere. Went to a recommendation to commence development on the separate standard using the overarching principles, and we have heard some words on refinement. The overarching principles have stood up reasonably well, and prepare a project proposal on that basis. So we're looking for a clear indication from here, and we've heard a clear indication from some, but if we could go around again and get a clear indication from board members as to whether they do that, that's very important, so that we can focus the work of the working group in the next 6 months, Tom. And if people do not agree with that approach at the moment, why not? And we'll see if we can address those particular issues too, as we're looking at forward, if that's the wish of the board. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Tom.
Thank you. Maybe to drive this efficiently, we have heard from some of those. By show of digital hands, who's in the affirmative on this question? Who supports what's being proposed? Okay, I'm just flipping pages to see. The only ones that I don't see of board members who are supportive of what's being proposed, obviously with some reflection on the principles, overarching principles. I see Kaiue and Eric with their hands down. Is that correct?
Yeah, as I have mentioned before, Tom, I have agreed to some of the requirements, but I have disagreed to some of the other requirements. So in total, let me see, I agree that the LCE working group commands development of a separate set of LCE standards. And I mean the plural, as I've mentioned before, but I'm not convinced that a single standard without definition and some application material is capable of being standalone. I note the comments I have made of some of the principles. That's my comment to question 3.
So if my interpretation is you're a yes with some caveats, those points were all issues that others have raised regarding the principles as well. And from what I took from Roger's intervention after my summary at the break was something that the working group would consider over the coming months. Is that correct, Roger?
Yes, that's correct. Those specific areas, Kai, we can work on, but there are certainly considerations for the working group as we put forward a project proposal. So,
yeah,
that's good.
I want to give Eric the opportunity to speak because his hand is down. And I think we got a sense of some of your concerns in your first intervention tonight on this topic.
Yeah, it's just I don't, it's not clear to me whether we are committed to revising these principles or not. And to me, some of them really just need to be changed because I don't think the standard will work as articulated with the current principles. So if there's agreement that we're going to have a narrow description of an LCE, if we're going to disconnect from the ISAs, and some of the other things I mentioned, then I'm on, I'm supportive. I'm just not clear that that's going to be done at this point because I know there were a number of different views. So that's all.
So I call that building on a concept that Bob Dorr mentioned, skeptical support or a wait and see approach, but not virulent objection. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Okay. I also wanted to give this opportunity to our PIOB observer to comment if you'd like, Karen. Obviously, it's not required, but this is a major public interest issue. And if you've heard the discussion today and now the instruction that the board is giving the working group to proceed with work on a separate standard.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. I just say that I think there was a very fulsome discussion of the issues that are in the public interest, a separate standard, what would be an LCE, the definition or non-definition, and the principles. So from my perspective, all the pieces that needed to be discussed for public interest have been. It will be a challenge to see how this will all come out, and also how to be responsive to the requests for urgent action. So I guess more to come as Roger works through to the next stage.
Thank you, Karen. We appreciate that point. Of course, you can't conquer a challenge if you don't step up to it in the first place. So we're conscious of that it will be a challenge to achieve all which we're attempting to achieve. But I think this is a clear direction that the board is giving us. Jim, from a CAG perspective, you have anything to raise?
Thanks, Tom. I think I articulated what we had discussed at the CAG previously, so I don't have anything else to add at this point.
I'll ask the senior staff to comment if they need any further clarification or feel like they've heard everything that they need to carry on with the board's work.
Yeah, nothing further. Thank you all for the very helpful comments. I think we have our work cut out for us over the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Nothing from me further, Tom.
Roger, anything to add? First of all, congratulations to the working group and staff for their efforts in this regard. It certainly hasn't always been easy or smooth, and you're hearing a cacophony of opinions, not just around this table, but around our stakeholder group. So well done to getting us to this point. And so congratulations and much appreciation to all of you. Any reflection, Roger, before we bring the meeting to a close?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Look, a very rich discussion. As Bev summarised, there's many considerations that we will go away. We've heard a lot of good advice, some conflicting advice that we'll just have to reflect on, and we'll reflect on that as to best way forward. And it was remiss of me at the start when I thanked my working group. I didn't thank my staff. A number of board members did thank my staff, but certainly the work that Kalina and Bev has done on this has been amazing, so reflection of the quality of the paper and the discussions. So thanks, Rich, for bringing that up and reflecting that their work in this area has been well recognised. So the working group will have considerations. We will work forward. We will work forward as we've outlined on both streams. So we will work forward on due process, on the due process and the clarity of the documents, and we will work forward on preparing project plan in this particular area. Bev, was there anything else you wanted to say on work on approach forward, or sufficiently covered? I think that's it from me, Tom. Yep.
Great. First of all, let me just thank everyone for the manner that you participated in this discussion. I think it was very constructive. I'm also glad that as it applies to standard setting, you guys are all using your professional judgment and skepticism to approach all of our topics here. So I really think that's important, and I think I'm pleased that all the public interest issues were shared and that we've had a robust discussion on it. The hard work really begins now because we're committed ourselves to a path forward, but I think the expectations are great. And as I believe it was Sue who raised this point, is how to manage our expectations gap as it relates to the LCE standard will be a big one. But at least we're willing to take this task on. And so I'm pleased that we've given the task of the working group a clear direction, and look forward to the hard work and incorporating your input over the coming months. And I'm sure that this won't be the only touch point with board members not on the working group between now and December. So we'll have meaningful input throughout to ensure a very successful project proposal approval in December. So thank you all. For those who are closing out the evening, including Imran, where as the hours tick to probably close to 2 a.m. now, Imran, have a good sleep. We're not far behind you on the East Coast. And for those in Australia and New Zealand and Singapore and Japan, have a great day. Hopefully this starts it off well for you. So thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Tom. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.